In a quiet workshop in the north of England in the spring of 1924, a man named Albert Finch stood at his workbench and cut the last sheet of pre-1870 window glass he would ever cut. He was 68 years old. He had been a glazier since he was 11. His father had been a glazier. His grandfather had been a glazier. And the sheet of glass in front of him, slightly wavy, faintly green at the edges, full of tiny bubbles the size of pinheads, had been sitting in his loft for 40 years, waiting for the right customer, the right window, the right reason to come down. That reason had arrived. An old farmhouse 3 villages over had lost a pane in a storm, and the owner, an old woman who remembered the way her kitchen used to glow at sunset, had asked Albert to match the original glass exactly. Not the new glass, the old glass, the glass that made the world look slightly liquid at the end of the day. Albert cut it carefully, wrapped it in newspaper and burlap, and walked it out to his cart. And when he came home that evening, his loft was empty for the first time in his working life. He sat down at his kitchen table, and he did not light a lamp because the last of the daylight was still coming through his own front window, and his own front window, of course, was made of the old glass. And he watched the sun go down through it, and he understood, in the way that only a man who has spent his life cutting something can understand, that an entire way of seeing the world was about to disappear from the earth. And almost no one would notice. If you find yourself drawn to the small, forgotten corners of economic history, the stories that hide inside ordinary objects, the way a single invention can quietly rewrite the way millions of people live without anyone ever writing it down, then please consider subscribing to this channel and leaving a like on this video. It genuinely helps these slower, stranger histories reach the people who want to hear them. Thank you. And now, let us return to Albert Finch and to the glass he cut, and to the dusk that no longer looks the way it used to look. To understand what Albert Finch was mourning that evening, you have to understand what window glass actually was before 1870. And to understand that, you have to forget almost everything you assume about glass today. Today, glass is invisible. That is its entire purpose. You look through a window and you do not notice the window. You notice the garden, the street, the sky. The pane itself is a kind of nothing, a clarity so total that children sometimes walk into sliding doors because their eyes cannot register that anything is there. This invisibility is a modern invention. It is younger than the steam engine, younger than the railway, younger than photography. For most of human history, window glass was deeply, stubbornly, beautifully visible. It had texture. It bent light. It had moods. And the people who lived behind it understood, without ever having to think about it, that the world they saw through their windows was not the world as it actually was. It was the world filtered through a thin sheet of slow, wavy, hand-shaped silica that had once been the breath of a glassblower's lungs. Pre-1870 window glass was made in 2 main ways, and both of them began with a man and a pipe. The older method was called crown glass. A glassblower would gather a blob of molten glass on the end of a long iron rod, blow it into a bubble, and then spin the rod at high speed. The centrifugal force would flatten the bubble into a wide, shallow disc, sometimes 4 feet across. At the centre of the disc, where the rod had been attached, there was always a thick, lumpy knot of glass called the bull's eye. The outer edges of the disc were thin and clear, and these were cut into small rectangular panes for windows. The bull's eye in the middle was considered waste, fit only for the cheapest applications, which is why you sometimes see it today in the windows of old pubs and cottages, where the original builders could not afford the proper edge panes. It is one of the great ironies of glass history that the bull's eye, once the rubbish of the trade, is now the most prized and most imitated piece of any old window. The other method, which gradually replaced crown glass during the early 19th century, was called cylinder glass. The glassblower would blow a very large, elongated bubble, swinging it in a deep pit to stretch it into a long cylindrical shape, sometimes 5 or 6 feet long. The ends were cut off, the cylinder was sliced lengthwise, and the slit cylinder was placed in a flattening oven and allowed to unroll itself into a flat sheet under its own weight. This sheet was larger than anything crown glass could produce, and it had no central bullseye, which made it more economical, but it was still unmistakably the product of human breath and human muscle. Every sheet had its own personality. The thickness varied from one corner to the other. There were ripples where the glass had cooled unevenly. There were tiny bubbles, called seeds, suspended in the material like insects in amber. There were faint streaks of colour, greens and pale blues, because the iron content of the sand was never quite consistent. And there were always the long, slow ripples of the surface, the gentle waves that betrayed the cylinder's origin, the memory of the bubble it had once been. This is the glass that Albert Finch was cutting. This is the glass that filled the windows of every house, every shop, every chapel, every cottage and counting house across Europe and North America for centuries. This is the glass that Jane Austen wrote her novels behind. This is the glass that the soldiers of Waterloo saw their last English sunsets through. And this is the glass that, in the second half of the 19th century, was very quickly and very quietly killed by an industrial revolution that most economic historians barely mention. The revolution began in the 1860s in the workshops of a German engineer named Friedrich Siemens, and the principle was simple. Glass requires extraordinary heat. A traditional glass furnace burned enormous amounts of fuel, and most of that fuel's heat went straight up the chimney and was lost to the sky. Siemens designed a regenerative furnace that captured the waste heat from the exhaust and used it to preheat the incoming air. The result was a furnace that ran much hotter, used far less fuel, and could be operated continuously for months at a time without cooling down. This sounds like a small technical improvement, the kind of thing that gets a footnote in a textbook. It was, in fact, the beginning of the end for an entire occupational class, because once glass could be made cheaply and continuously, the slow rhythms of the hand-blown trade began to fall apart. In 1871, William Pilkington patented a method for rolling molten glass between iron rollers. In the early 20th century, the Lubbers, Fourcault, and Colburn processes each took another step away from the human blower, until eventually the glass came directly out of the molten tank in a continuous sheet, untouched by any pair of lungs. And in 1959, Alistair Pilkington perfected the float glass process, pouring a ribbon of molten glass onto a bath of molten tin, producing a sheet so flat and so optically perfect that it changed forever what a window could be. Within a generation of the Siemens furnace, the hand glazier was no longer the maker of glass. He was only the cutter. Within 2 generations, he was no longer needed at all because the new glass came pre-cut from the factory. And within 3 generations, the very memory of what old glass had looked like began to fade out of common knowledge, surviving only in the windows of old houses that had not yet been replaced, and in the stubborn lofts of old craftsmen, like Albert Finch. Now, the standard story of this transition, when it gets told at all, is a story of progress. We made glass better. We made it cheaper. We made it more available. And all of those statements are, in their narrow way, true. But they are also profoundly incomplete because they treat the disappearance of old glass as a pure gain, with no losses worth counting. The revisionist economic history of this transition asks a different set of questions. What kinds of work disappeared, and what kinds of working lives were ended along with that work? What did houses look like before cheap large panes, and what did they look like after? What did the new plate glass storefront do to the relationship between buyer and seller? And finally, what did people see through old glass at dusk? And is there any sense in which we, the inheritors of perfect glass, have lost something irreplaceable? Let us begin with the work. The pre-1870 glass trade was one of the most highly skilled industrial occupations in Europe. A master glassblower trained for 7 to 10 years. He had to develop the lung capacity to inflate large bubbles with consistent pressure, the arm strength to swing a cylinder 5 feet long through a stretching pit, the timing to know exactly when the glass was cool enough to manipulate but still hot enough to flow, and the eye to judge thickness at a glance. He worked in extreme heat, often stripped to the waist, in front of furnaces that could blind a man who looked into them too long. He earned good wages and belonged to guilds that gave his family some measure of protection against accident and old age. He passed his knowledge to apprentices in the old slow way, by example and repetition. When the seaman's furnace arrived, and then the rolling machines, and then the drawing machines, none of this knowledge was needed any more. The new furnaces required attendants, not artists. The new machines required mechanics, not masters. And the wages that had supported entire villages around old glassworks began to fall, and the works themselves began to close, one by one, across the second half of the 19th century and the first decades of the 20th. The economic historian who counts only the falling price of glass per square foot will tell you that this was an unambiguous improvement. The economic historian who counts the disappearance of a craft, the breaking of a transmission of knowledge that had run unbroken from medieval Venice to industrial Belgium, will tell you that something quite serious was destroyed. Both are correct. The question is which losses we are willing to put on the ledger. The standard accounts have for a long time simply refused to put them on the ledger at all. They have treated the human cost of the transition as a sentimental matter, suitable for novels and folk songs, but not for serious economic analysis. The revisionist position is that this refusal is itself an ideological choice, and that a fuller economic history should include the destruction of skilled livelihoods as a real cost. But the changes ran deeper than the workshop. They ran into the house itself. Before cheap large panes of glass were available, windows were small. They had to be. A large window meant a large piece of glass, and a large piece of glass, in the era of crown and cylinder methods, was expensive, fragile, and almost impossible to ship without breaking. So domestic windows were divided into many small panes, held together by wooden glazing bars. The classic Georgian sash window, with its 6/6 or 8/8 pattern, was not an aesthetic choice. It was a technological constraint expressed as a style. When cheap large sheet glass became available, beginning in the 1870s and accelerating through the 1880s and 1890s, this entire architectural logic collapsed. A window could now be a single sheet, 4 feet by 6 feet, with no bars at all, or perhaps just one horizontal bar where the upper and lower sashes met. The Victorian 1/1 sash window, which dominated working class and middle class housing from about 1880 onwards, was a direct consequence of the new glass economics. And the change was not merely visual, it transformed the experience of being inside a house. The old small-paned window admitted light in a particular way. It broke the outside world into small framed fragments. The wooden bars cast shadows that moved across the floor as the sun moved across the sky. The eye learned to assemble the view from many small panels. The new single-paned window did something quite different. It dissolved the frame. It presented the outside as one continuous image. The wooden bars vanished and the room felt larger, and the outside felt closer, and the threshold between inside and outside became thinner than it had ever been before. We tend to think of this as a pure improvement. The revisionist point is that something was traded. The old window had taught the eye to compose, the new window asked the eye only to receive, and the change in shops was even more dramatic. Before the 1870s, a shop window was a row of small panes set in a wooden frame. The merchandise inside was visible piecemeal, glimpsed through small frames, never fully on display. The relationship between the customer and the goods was mediated. You had to go inside to really see what was for sale. You had to enter the shop, engage with the shopkeeper, ask to see the items, make a decision in conversation. With the arrival of cheap plate glass, this entire arrangement was overturned. Plate glass had existed before for grand uses like palace mirrors, but it had been ferociously expensive, made by casting molten glass onto an iron table and then grinding and polishing both surfaces by hand for weeks. The new continuous processes brought plate glass within the reach of ordinary commerce. By the 1880s, a shopkeeper of even modest means could afford a single huge pane for his front window, and once that pane went in, everything changed. The merchandise was now visible from the street in full, without entering. The window became a stage, the street became an audience. Looking became free, and looking became, for the first time in human history, a recognizable form of leisure. The word window shopping enters the English language at almost exactly the moment when plate glass becomes affordable. The economic implications of this are enormous, and they are still under-theorized. Mass consumer culture, the culture in which ordinary people spend significant portions of their time and identity looking at displayed goods, is partly a product of plate glass. The department store, which began to flourish in Paris and London and New York in the last quarter of the 19th century, depended entirely on the new glass. So did the modern shopping arcade. So did the boulevard with its illuminated frontages. Most economic historians have treated the rise of mass consumption as a story of incomes and advertising and credit, all of which matter, but they have neglected the simple material fact that you cannot have a culture of looking until you have something to look through. The new glass made the looking possible, and the looking, over the course of a century, remade the human relationship with goods, with desire, and with the city itself. Now, all of this is the public story, the story you can tell with statistics and patent dates and architectural plans. But there is a private story too, and it is the story that Albert Finch was thinking about that evening in 1924 as he sat in his unlit kitchen and watched the sun go down through his old front window. The private story is about what people actually saw day after day through old glass. It is a story almost no one has written, because it cannot really be quantified, and because most of the people who could have told it died before anyone thought to ask them. Old glass, hand-blown glass, cylinder glass, crown glass, all of these did something to light that modern glass does not do. They refracted it, they bent it slightly, they scattered it in soft, irregular ways. The bubbles inside the glass caught the sun and broke it into tiny pinpricks of brightness. The waves on the surface acted as weak, slow, accidental lenses, magnifying some parts of the view and softening others. The faint green or blue tint gave the whole scene a barely perceptible cast, a kind of distant undercolour that one stopped noticing consciously after a few hours, but that nonetheless coloured the entire experience of being in a room. And at certain times of day, particularly at dusk and at dawn, when the sun was low and its light was already being filtered through the long, thick slice of atmosphere near the horizon, the old glass did something extraordinary. It turned the world into a painting. You can still see this if you find the right house. There are still farmhouses and cottages and old country churches where the original glass survives, and if you stand in one of them in the last hour before sunset and you look out through the wavy old panes, you will see something that no modern window will ever show you. The horizon will appear to ripple very gently, like the surface of a slow river. The setting sun, instead of being a clean disk, will smear sideways into a long, elongated streak. The shadows of trees will lengthen and then split as they cross the imperfections in the glass, doubling and tripling in soft duplications. The colours will deepen, the golds becoming more golden and the reds more red. And the whole scene will appear to be at a strange distance, neither close nor far, but rather suspended in a kind of held moment, as if the dusk itself was slightly slower behind the old glass than it is outside. This is not romanticism. This is an optical fact. The handmade glass of the pre-1870 period had measurable surface irregularities of between 1 and 3 millimeters of variation across a single pane. And these irregularities created weak lens effects that genuinely altered the path of light through the glass. Modern glass, by contrast, has surface variations measured in microns so small that the human eye cannot detect any optical effect at all. We have gained accuracy. We have lost atmosphere. What does this mean? It is hard to say, because the experience of looking through old glass at dusk was never named, never theorized, never written into manuals. It was simply how the evening looked for everyone for centuries. Children who grew up before 1870 grew up with rippling sunsets. They did not know that sunsets could look any other way. The slight liquid quality of the evening, the way the world seemed to soften and tremble as the light failed, was, for them, simply the truth of dusk. Look at a Turner painting, with its blurred horizons and its sun smeared across the canvas in a long golden bar. Turner was painting what he saw, and what he saw, when he looked out of any window in 19th century England, was the world as old glass had filtered it. His paintings are reasonably accurate representations of the optical environment that every English person of his time inhabited every day. After 1870, this environment began to disappear. House by house, year by year, old windows were replaced with new ones, sometimes for breakage, sometimes for fashion, sometimes because larger panes simply became preferred. The slow, wavy golden dusk receded into a smaller and smaller number of buildings. By 1900, most new houses in industrial Europe had no old glass at all. By 1950, even most old houses had lost their original panes through replacement or war damage. By the year 2000, old hand-blown window glass had become so rare that specialist firms could charge enormous sums to supply small quantities for the restoration of listed buildings. The vast majority of people now alive have never in their entire lives seen a sunset through pre-1870 glass. They have not lost the experience in the sense that they ever had it. They have lost it in the deeper sense that they were never given it in the first place. This is why the figure of Albert Finch matters, not because his particular story is documented in any history book, but because he represents the very small number of people in the period roughly between 1900 and 1930 who could still cut old glass, who still had old glass in their lofts, and who still remembered from their own childhoods what the world had looked like before the great optical flattening. When the last of them died, the chain of living memory broke. There is no one alive today who saw a Victorian sunset through Victorian glass with the eyes of someone who had never seen any other kind of sunset. We can stand in the old rooms, we can look through the old panes, but we cannot unknow modern glass. We have nothing to compare the old experience to, and so the old experience can never be ours in the way it was theirs. The revisionist economic historian faced with this kind of loss has a difficult task. It is easy to count the price of glass per square foot in 1850 and again in 1900, and to demonstrate correctly that glass became more than 10 times cheaper in real terms across that half-century. These are the standard metrics of progress, and they are not wrong, but they are not sufficient. They do not capture the lost livelihoods of the glassblowers, and they do not capture the architectural transformation of houses and shops. They do not capture the way the new glass enabled and perhaps even partly created the consumer culture of the 20th century. And they certainly do not capture the disappearance of an entire optical environment. What kind of accounting could possibly capture all of this? The honest answer is that none can, fully. But the attempt is worth making. To attempt it is to insist that economic history is not only the history of prices and outputs and quantities, but also the history of how human lives feel from the inside. The cheap pane that replaced the expensive pane was an economic event. The disappearance of the wavy sunset was an experiential event. The two were caused by the same furnace, the same patent, the same investment decisions. They are not separate stories. They are one story, and the only reason we tend to tell them separately is that our intellectual habits have trained us to separate the measurable from the unmeasurable, the market from the life. There is one more thing to say about Albert Finch and about the old farmhouse window he repaired in 1924. We know from a brief account written by his granddaughter many decades later that the woman who commissioned the repair lived in the house for another 11 years. She died in her kitchen, in her sleep, on a summer evening in 1935, with the last light of the day coming through her window. The granddaughter, who had visited as a child, remembered the kitchen well. She remembered the soft greenish cast of the light, the way the trees outside seemed to sway even when there was no wind, the way the setting sun stretched and split across the panes into long shimmering bars. She remembered that her grandmother always sat in the same chair by the window in the last hour before the lamps were lit, and she remembered that her grandmother, who had lived through the entire transition from hand-blown to machine-drawn glass, used to say that the evenings had got harder somehow. She could not say exactly what she meant. She would simply look around at the modern windows in the modern houses of the modern village and shake her head and say that the dusk was not what it used to be. She was right. The dusk was not what it used to be. And the reason was not in the sky. The reason was in the glass. The sky was doing exactly what it had always done. It was the windows that had changed. The optical mediation that had stood between every European and the evening for 500 years had quietly disappeared, replaced by a clarity so perfect that nothing remained between the eye and the world. And the world, freed at last from the soft distortions of imperfect glass, became, in some hard and almost imperceptible way, more itself, sharper, more accurate, and also perhaps a little less hospitable to the human imagination, which had grown up over centuries with the gentle rippling of the old panes. Albert Finch died in 1931 in the same kitchen where he had watched his last sunset through his own old window. The house was sold by his children, and the new owners replaced the wavy old front window with a fine new pane of drawn sheet glass, much clearer and easier to keep clean. The old pane was thrown on the rubbish heap. No one thought to keep it. It was only a piece of old glass, the kind of thing that hundreds of thousands of households were quietly disposing of in those same years across Europe and America. The total quantity of pre-1870 window glass discarded between roughly 1880 and 1950 has never been calculated, but it must run into the millions of tons. Each pane was a small thing. Together they were one of the largest and least noticed acts of optical destruction in human history. We threw away the way our great-grandparents saw the world, and we did not even notice that we were throwing it away because we were looking through the new glass at the time, and the new glass made everything look so much clearer. That is the revisionist economic history of pre-1870 window glass. It is a story of progress, undeniable progress, in cost and availability and architectural possibility. It is also a story of loss, real loss in livelihoods and craft and inherited experience. And it is, above all, a story about how the largest changes in human life sometimes hide inside the smallest objects, the most ordinary materials, the things we look through every day without ever pausing to look at. The next time you sit by a window at dusk, particularly in an old house, take a moment to notice the glass itself. Look at its surface. Look for ripples, bubbles, faint greenish tints. Look at the way the sun, if it is setting, behaves as it crosses the pane. And remember that for most of the time that there have been houses with windows, the glass was alive in a way that ours is not. It had been breathed into being by a human being. It carried in its slight imperfections the memory of that breath. And it gave back to every dusk a quality of softness and slowness that we, the children of perfect glass, will never see again with our own eyes. We can read about it. We can stand in the rare rooms where it survives. But we cannot inherit it, because the chain of seeing has been broken, and the last people who saw it as their everyday reality are gone. Albert Finch was one of them. He cut the last sheet. He carried it carefully to its final window. And then he went home, and he sat in his unlit kitchen, and he watched the last dusk of his old life pass slowly through the wavy panes of his own front window, and he understood what was ending. And now, looking back across 100 years, we are beginning to understand it too.